Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Melissa. If you're here, it's because you, like me, like to learn about random history, facts, stories, people. So if that sounds interesting to you, please join me every Friday where I will be giving you a nice little history lesson while I do my makeup. For today's story, I do want to give a fair warning because the topic could be a possible trigger for some people. The story doesn't involve the harm of children, which I am a parent of 3, and this story it angered me, it frustrated me, and I just want to warn you in case, sensitive topics involving kids is a trigger for you. Today's story is on Williamina Dean. She was known as Minnie Dean. Minnie was born Williamina McCulloch. She was born September 2nd, 1844 in Greenock in western central Scotland, which is about 25 miles from Glasgow. Her father was John McCulloch. He was a railroad engineer. Her mother, Elizabeth Swan, would unfortunately pass away from cancer when Minnie was 13 years old. It's unknown exactly when Minnie arrived in New Zealand, but in 1868 she was living in Invercargill with her 2 young daughters. They stayed with an old woman they would refer to as Granny Kelly. Due to the discovery of large amounts of gold, there was a high rate of immigration into New Zealand during this time. So she would tell locals that she was the widow of a Tasmanian doctor. But there's no real proof of this ever being true. Partly because she always kept her birth name. And you know what? It didn't hit me until now why she did that. And I know she was lying. On June 19th, 1872, she married Charles Dean, who was an innkeeper. They lived in Edel Creek, which at the time was an important stop between Riverton and Otago, between the gold fields. As you can imagine, during the gold rush, with a bunch of people coming into the town as, miners, not miners, but they would mine, not like young children. There was a lot of business for Charles in the inn. A lot of people would stay there when they came into the town as prospect miners. So this would be a very popular stop for most travelers that were coming in. After the gold rush ended, less and less people would be obviously coming into the town. So the inn really took a hit. They didn't have as many visitors, so they weren't making money anymore. They really kind of went into some financial struggle. At around 1880, they had adopted a young 5-year-old girl. Her name was Margaret Cameron. In 1886, they moved into Winton, the 3 of them, Charles, Minnie, and Margaret, into a 22-acre farm called the Larks, which would be known for its beautiful hyacinths and dahlias. So farming was very important to Charles, and also for New Zealand's New Zealand's economy. But unfortunately, due to how difficult it was to farm, Charles wasn't able to really produce much of an income to really keep his family afloat. On top of this, soon after they moved into Winton, into the farm, so the house where they lived was a nice house. It was a 2-story house, 8 bedrooms, I don't even know how many square feet. Soon after they moved in, the house caught fire and it burnt down, like completely burnt down. So now Charles had to take a lien on the farm, and in its place he would build a 22 by 12 foot 1-bedroom little house. Charles would also buy some pigs, where he began pig farming because he wanted to be a part of the growing meat market in New Zealand. To help out with the finances, Minnie began what was known as baby farming. Baby farming, many would refer to it as a necessary evil. It was a practice that was most popular in Victorian Britain, where someone would accept custody of an infant or a small child in exchange of payment. During this time, contraceptives were not readily available to the public. The issue was that back then, women who would go through childbirth without being married were ostracized. So what these unexpected mothers would do, they would find, well, the only thing they could do was to try and find a way to, discreetly give their babies up for adoption. No questions asked. And this is where baby farmers came in, which baby farming then was, also frowned upon. Unfortunately, the places where these mothers would bring their babies, they would end up in places that were, incredibly unsanitary, unequipped, and just completely overpopulated. So many times, especially during this time, many babies and young kids would die. Also during this time, child caregivers would not be required by law to keep records of the children that they would take in. So really proving that somebody had a certain child was almost impossible. Just keep that in mind. So many would ask for payments either in lump sums or as weekly payments. It is believed also that she would be in charge of as many as 9 small children at any given time. And because she wouldn't only offer her services for adoption, she would also advertise herself as a babysitter. So parents could work or travel, or during the times where they were kind of trying to figure out what to do with a baby regarding the future of the infant. During this time, the child mortality rate in New Zealand was at a very, very high 10%. 80 to 100 out of every 1,000 live births. The fact that an infant would die under Minnie's care was, I guess, not too surprising. But on March of 1889 is when Minnie would kind of start getting the attention of the police after a 6-month-old who was under her care. So my camera totally overheated and just died. And I didn't notice until after I was done with my makeup. Which, it's whatever. But anyway, let's continue this story. Okay, so Minnie would kind of start being in the police radar, but not only police, but also the public. In March of 1889, a 6-month-old who was under Minnie's care died from convulsions after a 3-day sickness. And in October 1891, a 6-week-old infant also under Minnie's care died from a cardiovascular and pulmonary illness. So now this started rumors around the town about Minnie and, you know, what she was doing. So people started noticing that something was kind of weird, you know, with these kids dying under her care. Now the public wouldn't know about a 3-year-old boy who, under Minnie's care, also died. He drowned and she hid his body inside her garden. So now during this time, there was a case of a Margaret Waters who, like Minnie, would offer her baby farming services to desperate mothers in exchange of money. And under her care, would purposely neglect the children that she took in to the point where they died. And she went to trial. She was caught, and she was hanged in London in the 1870s. So now with all of this in mind is when the police started taking child care allegations more seriously. So this is why they started kind of keeping more of an eye out on Minnie. She was briefly investigated, but she was found to be not at fault for the deaths of those babies. But the coroner did make a statement that her home in which she was keeping the children was basically disgusting. So obviously the rumors were going around the town about Minnie's mistreatment of the children. Nobody trusted her with their kids anymore. There was also a talk around the town about how kids were going missing under her care, like mysteriously. So because of this and the people talking, they were they got it in their minds that she was linked to other cases of infanticide and baby farming in the UK and Australia. So during this time, there was other women in trial for doing the same thing people were saying that Minnie was doing. And they would be sentenced to death during their time, but their sentences would be lowered to life in prison. Now, like I said, because child givers were not required to keep records of the children that they were taking care of, proving that children under Minnie's care did indeed go missing was going to be extremely hard, if not impossible, to do. So because people were talking and nobody trusted Minnie anymore, she wasn't getting any more clients who would hand over their babies to her for money. So what she started doing was she started posting advertisements in the newspapers under assumed names, asking to adopt babies. It's also believed that she tried on few occasions to take out life insurance policies on some of the infants that she was taking care of, but fortunately she was not successful in doing that. I'm really close to the camera, sorry. So in 1893, Minnie would travel to Christchurch, where she met a woman who gave her a 3-week-old baby that she had agreed to put up for adoption. But the owner of the boarding house where Minnie was staying at noticed how she was treating this baby, and they were extremely concerned about what they were seeing. So they called the cops. The cops came and they took the baby away from her, fortunately. After this, Minnie would continue to put up flyers and newspaper ads, like still using fake names, assumed names, saying how she was a respectable married woman with no children who was looking for an infant to nurse for or to adopt. Unfortunately, all of her advertisements would work and many babies would be brought to her home. There were so many, in fact, that it worried the police commissioner enough to write to the Minister of Justice about his concerns of Minnie's adoption services. In April 15, 1895, Minnie traveled to Bluff to grab 1-year-old Dorothy Edith Carter. And after she grabbed her, she returned to Winton. 3 days later, with Dorothy, she was seen boarding a train from Winston to Lumsden with Dorothy in one hand and a hat box in the other. When she disembarked that train, she didn't have Dorothy anymore. She was only carrying this hat box, which was later testified by the railway porters that the box was suspiciously heavy, but they did not report it to the authorities at the time. So many, including the conductor, were worried about what happened to this baby that she was holding when she got on the train. So the conductor reported it to the police. After she got off the train, she booked a boarding house in Lumsden. That's where she spent the night. The following morning, she returned to the train station where she got on the train, and she took the train going north towards Dunedin. She boarded in Milburn, where she left the hat box in the luggage area before she met a woman by the name of Mrs. Hornsby. Mrs. Hornsby would give Minnie her 1-month-old granddaughter. Her name was Eva, as well as payment for Minnie services. Now, with baby Eva in her arms, she walked back, retrieved her hat box, and boarded the train back to Winston. So now police did follow up on the reports by the conductor, and they searched the train line, but unfortunately it was a 30-mile stretch from Winston to Milburn that she had traveled, and though they searched and searched, they were unable to find anything. So 2 years prior, John and Sarah Mackin were convicted baby farmers in the UK. They were sentenced and hanged. With this previous case in mind, they were obviously more worried, and they started investigating this baby who went missing on the train. They put out flyers and newspaper ads. They were reporting the incident. This is when Eva's grandmother, Mrs. Hornsby, read the report on the newspaper, so she contacted police, and she told them that she had met a woman in Milburn to whom she entrusted her 1-month-old granddaughter with, and now she believed that it was Minnie. Police and Mrs. Hornsby made their way to the Larks, where they met Minnie, and they were asking her where Eva was, who was clearly not there. Minnie and Charles were both arrested at this time, and police began searching the Dean's home. They were looking through all their stuff, and with Mrs. Hornsby there, they were asking her if she recognized any of the baby clothes that were in the home, and she actually came across an item that did belong to Eva, which is what she was wearing when she handed her over, but obviously nobody knew where Eva was. This is when police decided that they needed to dig up around the house, in the garden specifically, and that's where they gruesomely uncovered 3 bodies. One was of 1-year-old Dorothy Edith Carter, one was of a 3-year-old boy, and the third one was of 1-month-old Eva. Later autopsies concluded that Eva had passed from suffocation. Dorothy's cause of death was from a lithium overdose, and unfortunately the 3-year-old boy's cause of death was undetermined. Following further investigation, Charles was released. On June 18th, 1895, the trial of Williamina Dean began. I'll put it right here. I can't say it. Obviously, police, they knew. They were certain that Minnie was guilty, but she still pleaded not guilty. The audacity. Her defense lawyer would argue that the death of the infants was accidental and that she had secretly buried the bodies in her garden to prevent herself from receiving more of the public scrutiny that she was previously subjected to. This was a spectacle in the town. There was people outside of the courtroom. There were souvenirs being sold, and the most famous one was of a small baby doll, miniature baby doll, in a miniature hat box. Wild times. In total, it was hard to determine exactly how many children were under the care of Williamina Dean. 6 were confirmed to have died. 24 were looked after by her. One was returned to her family, to their family, and 5 children were living in the home at the time that they arrested Minnie and Charles. This is alongside the ones who had been supposedly adopted. But like I said, because there was no records being kept of these children, it was mostly Minnie's word. Many believe that she was also responsible for the deaths of all the other children who were unaccounted for, which I agree. On June 21st, 1895, the trial ends. Williamina Dean is found guilty of all charges, and she is sentenced to death. Yes. She spent 2 months in prison, and on August 12, 1895, she became the only woman in New Zealand to be hanged. Her last words were, "I have nothing to say except that I am innocent." She is buried in the cemetery in Winton next to her husband Charles, who died in 1908 after a house fire. She would be known as the Southland Witch, as she became somewhat of a boogeyman, worse than the boogeyman to people who lived in that area. It is said that Southland children who would misbehave, they were threatened not to be taken by the boogeyman, but to Minnie Dean's garden. There is also a wildflower in Southland named after Minnie, who everybody knows to be torn out as soon as it's spotted. It is also claimed that nothing will grow over Minnie's grave. Now, obviously this is a terrible, terrible story. The one good thing that came out of all of this is the new legislations passed in New Zealand regarding child welfare. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1893 and the Infant Protection Act of 1896. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1893 basically states that anybody who is taking care of a child for longer than 3 days has to be registered and licensed as foster homes, and they are subject to police inspection. The Infant Protection Act of 1896 is very long, but the Infant Protection Act of 1896 has a list of very specific scenarios where a child can be legally apart from their parents for longer than 3 days. And I'll have those linked down below just in case you want to read them. But that is the story of Miss Williamina Dean, the Southland Witch, the baby farmer. Yeah, kind of fucked up. Depressing. poor babies. I cannot imagine what they had to go through. And it's sad that there's still sick people like that around. But anyway, I don't want to drag this on longer than it needs to. If you liked this story, please subscribe and like this video. Help me out with some YouTube algorithm points. But anyway, if you enjoyed it, please come back every Friday for a new historical lesson, which this one was kind of a true crime historical true crime. I don't know. It was morbid to say the least. But if you enjoyed this video, please come back every Friday for a new lesson. Follow me on Instagram, and I will also have it linked down below. And yeah, thank you so much for being here with me today. Every like on this video is another empty hat box. Anyway, see you next Friday.